You are listening to Arcane Carolinas, an exploration of the Carolinas' folklore, legends, myths, and modern weird. Each episode, we examine the historical context of our topic and aim to preserve some of the stories that help make this part of the world such a fascinating place.
Hey y'all, Michael here. This is the second half of a two-part episode. I just wanted to jump in at the beginning to mention that, just in case you missed the first half, or you're somebody who just found out about the show, especially if you just met us at the Arcana Spooky Season kickoff. I'm also going to mention again that I'm linking to information on how to register and to vote in each of our two states and to the federal site with information for every state. Even if you haven't moved and you've voted in the same place for 50 years, check your registration and make sure everything is accurate. Go prepared. Make a plan, tell somebody, take your ID, and vote. And now, on with the show. Their initiations and their secret society infrastructure took two forms. They had a bunch of secret signs, handshakes, and phrases, and things like that.
Sure.
And they had a series of initiations and degrees. Their initiations were all based on Freemasonry.
Okay.
Freemasonry was having a big boom in the United States at the time, and it's very likely that a lot of the people organizing it were Freemasons.
So they could borrow bits and pieces.
Yeah. The things that we know...
It wasn't like a street gang, like we weren't getting jumped in.
No.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. There were people who claimed that they more or less got forced to join the Heroes of America, but they made that claim once they had been exposed as members of the Heroes of America. So, there are a lot of competing reasons there.
Sure. I slipped and fell and landed in the Heroes of America. I don't know how I got here.
There were places where anti-Confederate feeling was so widespread that the heroes basically were running the town.
Nice.
There were people who claimed I didn't actually care one way or the other, or, I was super loyal to the Confederacy the whole time, but I joined the Heroes of America because it was the only way to be safe. But it gets complex. It gets complicated.
Sure.
Once a single ideology is the only ideology that's allowed in a place, there are questions around how is that enforced.
Yeah.
But the Heroes of America at least had as their ideology, hey, the Civil War is bad, the Confederacy is bad, slavery is bad.
Right.
So I'm on board with all of that. They borrowed a lot from Freemasonry. Their structure of degrees was borrowed from Freemasonry. When you read what some of their rituals are described as being, then it's word for word Masonic rituals, except they swap out Freemasons for heroes.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it is word for word Masonic rituals. They had a secret series of handshakes, a secret series of touching their face and things like that in different ways they could use to identify each other. In the ghost town of Goshen Hill, we talked about how the professor whose hot air balloon crash landed in Union County was about to get murdered. He gave a Masonic hand sign, and one of the people in the mob was a Mason who recognized it and saved him. They had exactly that kind of stuff.
Cool.
They spread all of this via their chapter structure. Basically, most people in a town would only get initiated into what they call the first degree of being a brother in the Heroes. That person would be taught, here's how you recognize somebody, here's how you communicate that you're a member of the Heroes. If somebody uses these signs, do what they say. Then higher degrees of membership would confer more information about the structure.
Yeah, responsibilities.
Yeah, exactly. They also used a visual symbol to indicate membership to each other.
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about.
Yes.
Very visually oriented. So I'm like, tell me more about the logo.
It was a men-only organization, but members of the organization would sew a red thread into the lapel of their coat.
Ah.
If you saw somebody with a red thread sewn into the edge of their lapel, that meant they were a member of the Heroes of America.
That's cool.
They would also, in places where they could get away with really open stuff,
They had t-shirts.
practically, they would hang red cords in the windows of their homes or their businesses to indicate this place is a safe haven.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, if you were traveling around in the mountains of Western North Carolina at the time and you saw somebody wearing a red string on their lapel, some of them would, like a button, just wear a great big red cord on their lapel. And some would have it sewn into the lapel's edge, and some would hang it in their window.
Go full Rahab.
Yeah, you could initiate the signs.
Yeah.
And one of their signs was a set of phrases, and one of them was you would open by saying the word 3, either by itself or as part of a statement. And if the person responded with the word days, they were directly referring to the story of Rahab.
Yeah.
Because when the spies left Rahab, they said, we'll be back in 3 days.
Imagine that not working out, though. Being like, 3. And somebody's, do you have Tourette's?
Right.
Are you okay? 3 what?
And the other person is like, 4.
We're doing addition, subtraction, multiplication. What's your favorite number? That's how you say 3. What about misinterpreting it also? You go to the market, I'd like 3 apples. Would you now? Okay, listen, we're going to go down around the corner tonight at 7 p.m. The guy's, yeah, I really just want 3 apples, man. You jumped the gun. You didn't do the days thing.
I would believe that happened.
Sure.
I would bet that some of those people who were like, I apparently joined the Heroes of America, that happened to them.
Some over-enthusiastic person. They said the number 3, they're in. Tell them all the information. Somebody's going to come up to us at a convention now and say 3. And I'm going to forget, and I'm going to go, yes.
3 books.
Yeah.
The initial organizing for the Heroes of America had been by people who were really politically engaged already. And there were plenty of people who were just not politically engaged, just didn't care, just like at any era.
Again, it takes a lot to remove someone from their daily comfort. If you have an okay life, it's going to be difficult to motivate that person to remove themselves from that okay life.
Yeah. As the war kind of ground on at the year and a half mark, after everybody had been told it would be 90 days and it'll be over, when that didn't materialize, and then a year had passed and more than a year had passed, at that point the Confederacy was saying, okay, we're actually going to conscript.
Right.
And they started passing conscription laws.
I think it's human nature to want to preserve your way of life. Even jumping forward, like World War II, like we had isolationist policies in the wake of World War I leading up to that. It took Pearl Harbor for us to really get involved. I mean, we were providing shipping lanes and support in the Atlantic, and we knew what was going on. And it took that to pull us in.
Yeah. And that had followed a century of the United States having pretty isolationist policies and being like, we have our side of the planet and everybody else has their side of the planet and we're good over here. Right. And we don't need them and they don't need us.
To bring it home, well, it's going to be over 90 days. All right, well, go do your thing. Leave me alone.
March of 1862, the state was starting to conscript for the state militia. But by the summer of 1862, the Confederacy was saying, we're going to conscript for the Confederate Army.
So all of a sudden it's real.
Yeah, it's real. And we're not just going to conscript a few people. They passed laws saying that if you were a man between the ages of 18 and 35, you had to join the military immediately.
And 35 back then was like, not 35 today.
Yeah.
So that's desperate.
Yeah. They also immediately had to amend it to exempt from it anybody who owned a plantation.
Oh, that's dirty.
By the middle of 1862, the popular mood in the southern states was summarized by a phrase that got used a lot at the time, which was, this is a rich man's war and a poor man's fight.
Yep.
And that's just, everybody knew. Everybody knew.
Same as it ever was.
Yeah. And that caused a lot of people between the ages of 18 and 35, or who had sons between the ages of 18 and 35, to get politically engaged who had not been.
Yeah. Imagine being 35 years old. You're 35 years old. You're in okay health. You've got a family at that point, most likely. You're well into your career. You maybe get another couple of decades. If you don't break your leg or something, and somebody comes and says, hey, we know you're banged up and have 1800s quality health. Go fight for me. Yeah. I'm rich.
And
like,
your 16, 17-year-old kid, we're going to be back for him next year.
Right, exactly. All of a sudden, you're like, all right, it's time to get involved.
And when too many people failed to show up for conscription, the Confederate government amended the conscription laws again to say, when we said 18 to 35, what we actually meant was 17 to 50.
Oh, can you imagine an 1860s 50-year-old?
Yeah.
Go fight.
Yeah.
I'm fighting to get out of bed.
Yeah.
I'm fighting to get out of my wicker chair. They had wicker back then, right?
Oh, yeah, they had wicker.
Yeah, they had wicker. It wasn't like Lincoln log chairs.
No, it was not all Lincoln log chairs. They were literally putting people in a position where it was entirely possible that under that amended conscription law, a 17-year-old would be conscripted, his father would be conscripted, and his grandfather were being conscripted at the same time.
It's just ludicrous.
And if you owned a plantation, you were good. You were golden.
You didn't have to go.
Yeah. Or if you could just afford to what was called purchasing a replacement, you could just pay somebody to go in your place. So if you were rich but you didn't own a plantation, you could also get out of it. They also exempted anybody who, in the course of their
What about
work,
bone spurs?
I think that they probably did have a thing for bone spurs. That's why it remains a popular option.
Yeah. You can cut that if you want.
No, I don't want to cut that at all.
Making a joke.
Yeah.
Relax. Or don't relax. I don't care. I think it was funny.
I think it was really funny. Also, if in the course of your work you supervised the work of 20 enslaved people or more, you were exempted. It was really explicit.
So middle management was like,
yeah.
whew, thank goodness I worked my way up to middle management of trafficking humans.
Yeah. It was so explicit that the point of the war was to preserve chattel slavery and the plantation economy, that literally everybody else was expected to die before the Confederacy would allow the plantation owners and the people closest to them to feel any effects. That was really spelling doom for the Confederacy from within.
You know, I won't go there. It's fine.
Okay.
Anything that starts with, you know, oftentimes isn't worth following up on.
Fair enough. A lot of people openly defied conscription orders.
Sure.
Because it was completely ridiculous.
I'd like to think that I would for at least the first round. Like, if somebody's not showing up with a gun to my head, I'm going to be like, yeah, I'm not turning up for that.
Yeah. Then the Home Guard started showing up and putting guns to people's heads.
Right.
Then people started looking for communities where they could relocate to and be protected, especially those communities where the red strings were visible in a literal and a figurative sense, where the Heroes of America was operating and people knew these are communities where we can go and we will not be threatened by Confederate
Open
authorities.
defiance.
Oh, yeah. Those towns started turning into magnets for people who were refusing to show up for conscription orders, people who were Union soldiers who had escaped the Confederate prisons in the South, people who had escaped human enslavement, people who had lost everything to the Home Guard, people who had lost everything to the Confederate military, people whose families had lost the people who could actually go engage in the economy on their behalf. A ton of people either had to run away or had taken from them everything in their life.
I have a story that I want to share with you that we'll have to cut.
Sure.
Because the episode won't have aired. Anyway, point is, I was down in this cave.
Yeah.
And it was a manganese mine that was being used during World War II for gunpowder. Manganese is in gunpowder. And there was graffiti down in this one section of the mine where people carved their names into it. And there was a young person that had come from St. Louis all the way down to Arkansas. And so, you know, like Bill Smith, age 19, the date, St. Louis, Missouri to wherever, Arkansas. And we're standing there, we're looking at it, and there's all these different names like carved into this one section. It was pretty cool. Somebody, I forget who, was like, why would that person come all the way down from St. Louis to work in a cave in Arkansas? I'm like, he was avoiding the war.
Yeah.
He didn't want to go fight in the army. So he got this job instead. So he was contributing to the effort. People would do whatever they could do in some circumstances, even in a just, I'm using quotes, war, where there's an obvious axis of evil.
Yeah.
What the Japanese were doing to the Chinese was evil. What the Germans were doing to all of Eastern Europe was evil. They were bad.
Yeah. Nazis were bad.
Yeah, Nazis were bad.
Yeah.
What the Japanese were doing was bad.
Yeah.
And I know that we're cutting all this.
We're going to cut some of it, but it's going to turn out to be very relevant in a minute. So keep going.
Okay. I think even in the face of a just cause, there is a sense of self-preservation that kicks in. So in the face of an unjust cause, specifically where there are exemptions for people of higher socioeconomic status, get the bleeps out because that.
Totally. You are absolutely right. And everybody agreed at the time that this was happening. That was the time when Heroes of America spread from the Quaker Belt throughout the South and operated all the way from Wilmington to Missouri. Actually, as an example, one of the things the Confederacy did with people who were conscientious objectors, and one of the ways they tried to get what they thought were the political organizers out of the Quaker Belt, was by saying, fine, if you tell us that you can't fight because of your religion, you have to go work in the salt mines outside Wilmington.
I knew that. And also leatherworking.
Yes.
So they would use them for salt mines and leatherworking.
Yeah. Then salt mines outside of Wilmington became loci of espionage work and of communication with the Union authorities because the Union was very nearby. All these people who were not engaged in the war were also listening all the time as military people from the Confederacy around them were talking, and they would pass that information straight to the Union. So the Confederacy's attempt to prevent these people from organizing, simply put them in one place where they had access to a bunch of information and the other side, and they continued organizing.
A real hot spot.
Yeah. The Confederacy, it turns out, was not hugely smart. We were not sending ourselves our best people. A couple of examples of high-profile members of the Heroes. One of the high-profile organizers responsible for the growth of the Red Strings during this era specifically, and in response exactly to that sentiment, was this guy named Dr. John Lewis Johnson. He had studied to become a doctor by apprenticing himself to another doctor in Lexington in the 1840s, and then when he was ready to start his own practice, he moved to Winston-Salem and established practice there. Then that practice got disrupted by the start of the Civil War. He was not interested in joining the Confederacy. He was not interested in secession. He was himself personally an abolitionist. But Confederate authorities knew that people who were not enthusiastic about secession were not joining the military by choice. Mm-hmm. Before conscription, and then after conscription also, one of the tactics they used to try to get people to expose themselves as anti-Confederate was to pressure them to join the Confederate military and see what they did.
I can see that tactic working.
Yeah, and it did a lot of times. He was one of the people who knew that if you hadn't volunteered, you were being pressured to volunteer to prove your loyalty, quote unquote. So he volunteered for the Confederate military, basically to save his family.
Right.
In doing so, he got assigned to the Army of Northern Virginia, and he was told to go be an assistant surgeon in that army during the Antietam campaign. Yeah, he was seeing some really brutal and bleak conditions. And he was working for, by coincidence, that doctor that he had apprenticed to 20 years earlier.
I got a 10% success rate. I'm the best doctor on the battlefield.
Yeah, pretty much. It makes me think of a sketch from the revived Kids in the Hall. 61% of the time, I don't drop the baby. So, yeah, 61% of the time, I saw their leg off. He volunteered in July of 1862. Then, almost immediately after getting up there, he, quote unquote, accidentally wound up on the Union side of the lines and turned himself in and got taken prisoner.
Oh, no.
Oh, no. Yeah. Oh, darn. And whereas there were people who languished in prisons on both sides for years.
Yeah.
He was out and on his own again by September of 1862. He returned to North Carolina and immediately started recruiting for the Heroes of America. He was one of the people who helped it spread using the Underground Railroad in specific. It would be easy to assume from that the Union and that the Lincoln administration was really actively engaged with the Heroes of America, but actually it is the opposite case. He went up there and talked to everybody he knew about the Heroes of America and tried really hard to get the Union government to support the Heroes of America and provide assistance and aid and communications links and everything. And they said, no thanks.
They declined to support an insurgency.
They couldn't be sure that the information coming from him or the organization was legit.
Sure.
And the 1864 election was coming up. They were worried that if word got out, it would be seen as an attempt to extend the war by keeping the Confederacy churned up.
Right.
So they said, welp, we're just going to have to not support this. And if it works out for them, then that's great. But no connections. We are not going to be a part of that. And if they feed us information, then we'll see if it's useful.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
CIA just gives everybody guns.
Yeah, right. If you just sell everybody all the weapons, then who cares? Who wins?
Just wound up on a list.
Again. One of the reasons why they were suspicious also, the Heroes of America, was because they knew that a lot of opposition to the Confederacy in the South was not actually from super progressive, pro-abolition, anti-slavery forces. In the South, the big political divide among the people in power, not among the larger population necessarily, but among the people in power, was not pro-slavery and anti-slavery, pro-secession and anti-secession. It was the people who said, we need to keep fighting so that we can be totally independent. And the people who said we need to stop fighting because when we lose the war and the Union invades and takes us over again, they will set the terms. Mm-hmm. But if we surrender now on our own terms, then we get to keep all the stuff we like. There was a big conservative movement in the South to end the war and rejoin the Union, thinking if we offer to come back,
concede on X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
I get to stay in my house, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And importantly and explicitly, their position was if we surrender on our own terms, then they can't make us give up slavery.
Still hanging on to that. Huh?
Oh, yeah. That was the whole point.
Oh, when I said make concessions, I thought that was going to be one of the concessions.
No. Oh, they were willing to give up everything but that. All the writing by Confederate opponents to the war was, we have to go back to the Union because otherwise they're going to make us give up slavery. Explicitly, that was their point.
Oh, I won't do a Hank Azaria impression, but there's an episode of The Simpsons where Apu is applying for citizenship, and they're like, so what was the Civil War about? And he's, well, it was a complicated matter. And he goes, just say slavery. He goes, slavery. And I'm like, congratulations, you're a citizen.
There you go. Yeah, that's the deal. If you read the Confederate Constitution, it had two differences. It was a complete copy and paste job. It was literally word for word the Constitution of the United States with two changes. One, there were two states that were in the middle of a fight about shipping on a river. And the Constitution of the Confederacy addressed that to make them shut up.
Specific river.
Yes, a specific river. The only other difference was we will continue to have slavery and nothing can amend this Constitution to end it. That was it. Those were the two differences.
Yeah, that's how you build something that lasts.
Yeah, that's how you get a country that lasts fewer years than the Golden Girls. But they knew people who were opposed to secession and to the war in the South were not necessarily big proponents of good stuff. They were people who were trying to continue doing the bad stuff that they were worried losing the war would take away from them.
Oh, because they were comfortable. They were making a ton of money.
Well, yeah. Throughout 1863 and 1864, Johnson organized anyway, even without the Union support. The heroes continued to spread and to grow in numbers, and they supplied information to the Union wherever they could. During this period of time, he was working as a doctor in a hospital in Raleigh.
Okay.
And he and a bunch of other people who were in charge of the Heroes of America formed the Grand Council of the Heroes of America. So when the kids in the treehouse are like a musket man, that's what they were up to.
That's awesome.
Yes.
That's awesome.
By 1864, however, Johnson had to go back to the North, and he and the Heroes of America's representatives in D.C. had, in fact, convinced the Union that it was worth it for them to know about the Heroes of America so that when the Union Army invaded, if they saw red strings, they could Rahab it. Yeah. The whole deal was, if we induct you in, literally, this is what Johnson and the other leadership of the Heroes of America said to the Lincoln administration. We'll induct you into our secret society so that you know the signs. And then when your army shows up in North Carolina or in upstate South Carolina or in Southwest Virginia or anywhere else that we're operating, when you see those signs, you'll know to leave those people alone. That was the deal they struck. Johnson initiated Abraham Lincoln into the Heroes of America and taught him the handshake and the signs and the phrases and the whole 9 yards. And Abraham Lincoln became a member formally of the Heroes of America.
What?
As did a bunch of people in his cabinet.
Yeah, you're standing there and the boss gets in the club. I want in the club.
Ulysses S. Grant was a member of the Heroes of America.
I'm sure you're going to get to this. How long did this society persist?
In the middle of 1864.
It ended. No.
Pretty much.
Oh, no. Really?
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh.
To some degree, a lot of this, like I said at the very beginning, has to be inferred because the success of the Heroes of America means that a lot of the details of their operations remained secret. But in 1864, there was an election for governor in North Carolina. Two candidates were Zebulon Vance. Anybody who knows Asheville knows the Vance Memorial, et cetera, which is gone now, thank goodness. Vance had started the war being a peace man. He was like, I don't think that the war is a great idea, and I think it's probably smarter for us to settle things and go back to the Union, but he didn't want to be seen as quote-unquote disloyal. His biggest supporter was this guy named Holden, who was the publisher of the North Carolina Standard, a newspaper that we have referenced in a bunch of stories. Holden was a big Vance supporter, and he was one of Vance's closest advisors. By 1864, Vance had, because of political pressure and his desire to win the 1864 election, become a very vociferous advocate for continuing the war and said, we have to keep fighting because the only way that there can be peace that allows us to stay in power is if we have peace at the end of our sword. Holden was a peace man of the let's settle the war and return to the Union so that we can keep slavery variety.
Okay.
He was not a big abolitionist. He was not a big progressive. He had some progressive political ideas. He was a favor of what was called full manhood suffrage. At the time, in order to vote, you had to be a white man who owned property.
Okay.
And he wanted to extend the vote to all white men.
To the poors.
Yeah. That was his big, bleeding edge, progressive idea.
It's a different time, you see.
It was a different time, indeed. Holden had advocated in the course of that election for a state convention. He wanted the state legislature to call a convention to authorize a body to go negotiate peace with the Union on behalf of North Carolina and just say, that's it, we're out of here. We're not a part of the Confederacy anymore. Mm-hmm. We just want to rejoin the Union. Let's just do this on our terms. And the rest of these people can keep fighting if they want to. Mm-hmm. That was not a popular idea, and it did not succeed.
Why not? It would be exercising states' rights.
The Confederacy literally said to North Carolina, you can't do that.
But I thought it was about states' rights, Michael.
The Confederacy said you can't leave the Union to join the Confederacy, only to leave the Confederacy. That would be wrong. And it's illegal. The Confederacy's whole response to it was it's illegal to try to secede.
I don't even know what to do with that. I'm sitting here looking at you like I know I'm supposed to be doing commentary on this episode. I'm like, really? That's what they went with, huh?
The pro-slavery. The only way to preserve personal liberty is to perpetrate slavery. People also felt that the only way to preserve states' rights was to prevent states from leaving.
Having rights.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how it worked.
That's delicious.
Yeah. Holden's whole big plan got rejected by the General Assembly because the Confederate government was like, no, big thumbs down. Yeah. But in the course of it, the race between them, the campaign, was very, very heated. Vance became a more and more outspoken advocate for continuing to prosecute the war. Holden became a more and more outspoken advocate for negotiating peace. In the course of that, a pro-Confederate newspaper in North Carolina called the Daily Confederate.
How often did it come out?
Weekly.
Okay.
I don't know. By then, paper was probably pretty hard to get your hands on, so it might have been not exactly daily.
Not quite Daily Confederate.
Might have been daily in spirit more than in execution. It was led by this guy named McCrae. He was a real not fun guy.
Piece of work?
Yeah. I started to say something really bad, and then I was like, family show. But McCrae ran an article in 1864, quote unquote, exposing the heroes of America and claiming that Holden and everybody in his side of the party, the elections at the time during the Confederacy were between the Confederate Party and the Conservative Party.
Okay.
We talked in the Henry Berry Lowry episode about how the Confederate Party was the single party that the Confederacy recognized. And then after the war, there was this Conservative Party, and that these were both just renamed versions of pro-secession Democrats. Mm-hmm. They were divisions within that pro-secession wing of the Democratic Party.
Sure.
In the same way that if you think back to like 2010, there were a bunch of Republicans who found themselves very surprised to be facing primary opponents who said they were from the Tea Party.
Oh, yeah.
It is exactly that kind of arrangement.
Okay.
There were these people who said, yeah, we're Confederates, but we're the Conservative Party wing of the Confederate Party.
Gotcha.
And they ran opposing candidates.
2010 feels like forever ago.
Doesn't it? How different things have gotten as quickly as they have.
Yeah. There are people that listen to this show that weren't alive in 2010.
Yeah, totally.
I'm going to stop feeling old now.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just the way it is.
It's that Matt Damon gif from the end of Private Ryan just happens.
Time passes. But Holden and Vance were on opposite sides of the question of settling the war. Mm-hmm. Holden was the Conservative Party candidate for governor, and Vance was the Confederate Party candidate for governor. And this pro-Vance, pro-Confederate newspaper ran an expose of the heroes of America in which they said they were publishing a confession by this guy who was a minister.
Was he real or did they make it up?
He was a real person.
Okay.
He was a real person who probably did really write that confession.
Oh, that sucks.
But he probably did so under great duress.
Sure.
His confession detailed the signs and symbols of the red strings and how their degree structure worked and how people got initiated into it, and that Holden was a member of the Heroes of America, and everybody in his party was a member of the Heroes of America, and everybody who was voting for him was Heroes of America, and that they were all secret abolitionists. And this was really just made up. It might be that Reverend Churchill exposed all the stuff for their signs and secrets, and it might be that somebody literally put a gun to his head and said, write down that Holden is a member of the Heroes of America. But there's actually pretty good agreement among historians that Holden probably knew that there were secret societies and might even know that there was a big one, but he was not a part of it and was not involved. This was purely political propaganda.
So whenever something gets big enough that the president's in the club during a civil war,
sure, yeah,
there's spies on either side.
Yeah.
I have no doubt that they were aware of it.
Yeah.
Just what a crappy way for it to get the rug pulled.
There were people who were the justices of the peace in locations and were sheriffs in those locations. And there were even people who were the officers in charge of companies of the Home Guard, who were members of the Heroes of America. There was one entire unit of the Home Guard that was just Heroes of America, who formed a unit of the Home Guard as a way to stay out of everything else.
I love that.
And they wouldn't go around and harass people. They would just be like, yeah, we're the Home Guard. Don't worry. We're good. Don't you worry about us. We're definitely on your side. And we are all in agreement.
We need
on
some
that.
more snacks.
Yeah. Exactly.
Send more rations.
That was pretty much the level they were on.
We're definitely going out to see what we can see this weekend. We're going to need some more supplies. And they just go camping.
Yeah, pretty much.
It's like, woohoo. That was a fun camping trip. Well, sure was. Yeah. Want to do it again next week? Yeah, I'll write a letter for more supplies.
Yeah. We're going to fight organizing by all these deer.
Right.
But it was very widespread. What followed quickly after this expose was this wave of newspapers who were pro-Confederate running quote-unquote confessions by people who were in the Heroes of America. A lot of those were probably made up.
Sure.
A lot of those were probably people who needed to say something, preserve their own skin. A lot of them were probably people who didn't really know what they were getting into at first, and then were kind of surprised to find out that they were political organizers. So there was probably a spectrum of intent and reality behind these quote-unquote confessions.
Also, there was probably people that just didn't exist. And you mentioned the editors of these papers being motivated in certain ways, just being like, oh, well, we'll run one. Go ahead and write something like that and just slap a name in there.
Exactly. There was a ton of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So there was this several weeks period in the lead up to the 1864 election where newspapers were chock full of people talking about the Heroes of America. But that's also where we get some of the few instances of being able to attribute specific actions to them. It was claimed in some of those confessions that the Heroes of America had actually blown up 2 railroad bridges in order to cut off Confederate supply lines in the Piedmont. And those were railroad bridges that had been destroyed. After those railroad bridges were destroyed, the Confederate military did have to start posting units to guard its bridges, which kept more people away from the fight, which further drained this already strained to the point of breaking attempt to have a military. So it had real effects.
Yeah.
But the end result was that it got pretty much too hot in a lot of places.
Can I tell you what my hope was? How long have we been doing this? An hour and a half?
Yeah, something like that. This is definitely a 2-parter episode, and thank you for your patience.
So probably over an hour ago, we'll say 70 to 80 minutes in, like pretty early once you said, man, I hope this thing is still around. I was really hoping that they had morphed into something and it was still around.
I don't know.
That's the thing about secret societies, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah.
Because you and I have talked about how cool it would be to start a secret society.
Oh, yeah, totally. No, I would love that.
This is probably, Arcane Carolinas and the community around it is probably the closest we've come to creating a secret society.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
You hear that? You're in. You're in. If you're listening, you're in.
Yes.
No takesies, backsies.
Right. No exposing any of this in newspapers either.
No, actually, please expose this in newspapers.
It would be great for our stats, frankly. At the beginning, they had all this secret hush-hush stuff. And then by the end, they were having over 100 meetings in 1863.
They had towns.
They had towns. They would have meetings where over 1,000 people would show up.
They'd have big pickings.
Yes.
Right.
They had everything. You name it. In a lot of ways, the Heroes of America became the political infrastructure and the social infrastructure and the professional and economic underpinning of entire communities during this time. The Confederacy was so scared of it. Different individual units of the Confederate military led by officers who decided that this was big enough to be worth their time would travel to Raleigh to ransack the offices of the North Carolina Standard because Holden was known to be a peace man. And the next day, the Heroes of America organized a riot to go attack a pro-Confederate newspaper and ransack their offices. And stuff like that was really starting to become big. The Confederate Congress had their elections, their quote-unquote midterms, in odd-numbered years. In the 1863 elections, the majority of seats in the Confederate Congress from Alabama and North Carolina were peacemen. So the Confederate civilian leadership was starting to get really nervous, and the Confederate military was starting to get really nervous, and they were facing the fact that they were having to deal with insurgencies from within and prosecute a war outside and everything. So they were not doing great. It's worth remembering that, again, the only people who could vote then were white men who owned property. And their sentiment was so against secession and against Confederacy that anti-Confederate candidates were winning elections in the middle of the Confederacy. So imagine what it was like among the rest of the population.
Well, I mentioned earlier, dude, I would be so fired up to be like average Joe. Just a dude trying to make his way in the world.
Yeah.
You can't vote because you don't own land.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody that does own land, plantation owners are making money hand over fist, waging a war, sending your kids to die in it, sending you to die in it. I wonder if it was shorter than the run of the Golden Girls.
Yeah. The Confederacy was so concerned that by 1863, 1864, they formally suspended the writ of habeas corpus. They said, we can send the military to put anybody in jail for as long as we feel like, and we don't need a reason. That's what that meant.
Yeah.
They also started openly saying there will be violence against people who oppose us. In the course of Vance's election run in 1864, he went to the mountains specifically to go on a speaking tour where he would go to towns that he knew were anti-secession, anti-Confederacy, and he would give a speech in which he said, if you don't back us, then you'll end up getting killed.
I'm going to go on a threatened tour.
Hearts and minds.
Yeah, right. Imagine that just for a second.
Yeah.
You know that very famous photo of Kennedy speaking to people in West Virginia?
Yeah.
I am aware that the unfortunate, unpopular war has not started yet, but if you do not back it, we're going to kill you.
Yeah, that's pretty much the argument that was being made. Except we're 4 years into this war, and I promised it would be 90 days. And if you don't get behind us, then I promise things are going to go really bad for you.
Imagine that in the common era.
I'm not sure I have to work too hard to imagine a well-known candidate threatening violence against opponents. Actually, call me crazy.
The biggest violence.
We're going to have the best violence.
We're going to have the best violence. We're going to have the biggest violence.
I say
I've seen other violence. It's just very sad. It's very low energy.
It's not hard to imagine, actually, that happening. He was very explicit. We ran a rebellion, and we can't believe you're rebelling against it, became the rhetorical position of the Confederacy. And again, a lot of the people opposed to secession and to the Confederacy, they were not doing it out of the kindness of their hearts. They were not doing it out of this big love for all people and a desire to create a utopia. They were doing it to preserve chattel slavery. His speech literally was, it'll be worse for you if you have to deal with us than if you have to deal with the Union. I don't know how that was supposed to make people favor the Confederacy.
Yeah,
but
that's not how you win people over.
Yeah. Anyway, the Confederacy knew they were losing their own elections at this point. Stuff had gotten really bad. The Confederacy had to start garrisoning troops in Raleigh because there was so much open organizing and agitating against the war.
Sure.
One of the factors that supported the Heroes of America was that the 1850s saw the start of professionalizing a lot of industries and the rise of like the white collar worker.
Okay.
There were a lot of people in cities in the South who were not part of the plantation system. They did not benefit from it. Mm-hmm. They did not personally have enslaved people working for them. They also were not allowed to vote. They didn't own any property. They weren't getting paid. They didn't have any reason to favor this system.
Well, that's the exact person that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
That I find to be incredibly relatable.
They became a real hot button topic. The Heroes of America became a real hot button topic in the course of that 1864 election. And then as soon as the election was over and Holden had lost and Vance had won, Vance won big in that election. As soon as that election was over, newspapers just stopped talking about the Heroes of America.
That crap still happens today.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Where the people will get so whipped up into a I hate my neighbor frenzy over something that they will forget about within months.
Probably within hours. As it leaves the 24-hour talking head news cycle, it just immediately is forgotten.
The views expressed in this show by me are views of me, and not necessarily Michael or Arcane Carolinas, a podcast or book series. But I'd like to factor that into the list of things that I said that I don't like earlier.
Yeah. Almond and Scarborough, when they're writing about the Heroes of America, point out that you can tell the conversation around the Heroes of America in the course of 1864, after everything had been exposed in newspapers, was purely political propaganda because there was almost no actual legal prosecution. There were no consequences outside of the threat of violence and being forced to make confessions. There was no institutional response to the heroes of America. It wasn't like the Confederate authorities then went around and arrested everybody that was on the big lists of members that had supposedly been written up and tried them all for something. It wasn't like they even, using the suspended writ of habeas corpus, threw them in prison. They just ignored it.
Right.
As soon as it had lost its utility in the election, they didn't give a rip. It was just
on to the next thing.
Yeah, exactly. On to the next thing. The fact that there was no legal action pursued against almost anyone for this is partly evidence of that. It's also partly evidence that in so many places, those legal authorities were a part of the organizing. They were just going to make sure that nothing happened anyway.
Sure.
There were times and places when people tried to pursue legal action against organizers. It would turn out that the justices of the peace who were going to try the case and prosecute it.
3!
Yeah, they would all basically be like, so we're not going to do this, right? And then they just wouldn't do it. They would just ignore it.
They'd all yell 3, somebody would yell days, and then move on.
They just refused to arrest anybody, refused to carry out any cases against them. In fact, in one of the few instances where somebody wound up in court being accused of being part of the Heroes of America, their attorney argued, well, we've all read in the newspapers what it's like. It's no more dangerous than Freemasonry. And the judge said, sounds pretty legit to me, and threw the charges out on the basis that, well, it was just a secret society. Who cares?
Yeah, there was a bunch of them back then.
Yeah. The lawyer was himself a Freemason and was able to say, I can speak with authority.
Right.
Nothing that they've told me is anything worse than anything happening in any other Mason's lodge.
Please come out to the pancake breakfast on Saturday. We'll be raising money for some family that a donkey kicked a kid, and we're going to help fix the kid's leg.
Even so, there had been so much publicity at that point that the Heroes of America couldn't really continue to operate effectively. A lot of people were just afraid to attend meetings. A lot of people had been scared off. A lot of people were worried about consequences because they did not have the advantage of looking back. For them, it was all still an open question of maybe we're going to wind up in a Confederate prison for the next 10 years. A lot of their operations just shut down. However, once Reconstruction started, the Republican Reconstruction governments in the South revived the Heroes of America as a civil organization that was an arm of Reconstruction.
We're back, baby!
They continued to operate for another 5 or 6 years.
Cool. It's such a noble title. There should be an organization now that uses it.
Even though their success as a secret organization makes it very difficult sometimes to pick out their activities from history, one of the most interesting things about them that I read is from a book published in 1956 about an organization that was a baseball team.
What?
In 1956, a guy named Macon Rush Dunnigan published a book called The Yadkin Red Strings. It's a very thin book. It's like maybe 50 pages, 100 pages, something like that. I found a copy in the State Library of North Carolina. I'm sure there are copies elsewhere.
Amazing.
In 1956, he published this book, and it was about his favorite baseball team from his childhood, talking about how cool they were, how much he liked them. He did this purely as, I want to make sure that their story is preserved. That team was an amateur baseball team. It operated for 7 seasons between 1896 and 1902. So 30 years after the
They had a beer league softball team.
They had a beer league softball team, yeah. This was a time before professional baseball, or at least before professional baseball was anywhere around here. I don't know when baseball started, but this was an explicitly amateur baseball team operating in a league of amateur baseball teams. They formed in Yadkin County, North Carolina. The team was made up almost entirely of a bunch of farm boys who all lived within 3 miles of the community of Center in Yadkin County, because that was where they could get to practice, and that was where their field was for their home games. When they played away games, they traveled there in a horse-drawn wagon. This is that era.
They'd all pile into the Nissan.
They'd all pile into the Nissan. Maybe it was. I don't know. Wouldn't that be nice? I'd love it if they all piled into the Nissan. The team was organized by this guy named Gus Long. He was the person who arranged games and all that stuff. He was referred to as Captain Long. And Dunnigan says in his book, nobody seemed to know why they called him Captain, but they did. Everybody called him Captain Long. The baseball team had been organized initially by Quakers who had brought baseball with them to the area. Again, in the book, Dunnigan says, also nobody could tell me why he named the team the Red Strings. He assumes in the book that it's because in the trousers that they wore as their homemade baseball uniform, there was a red stripe down the left leg.
That's totally connected. That's awesome.
He says, well, they had this thin red stripe on the leg of their trousers. That must be why they were called the Red Strings. I don't know why that was important to them. And then he goes on to write this book about how they were just this powerhouse baseball team. In 7 seasons, they played about 60 games because it was amateur baseball. They didn't play a 100-game season. They only lost 3. There was just this ridiculous, absurdly good team. And
amazing.
That was what he wanted to remember about them. He has these little details about their formation and the window when they formed.
So he accidentally documented Heroes of America. Legacy continuation.
Yeah. He says in the book that people in the community were uncomfortable with them being named the Red Strings. He thinks it's because at the time, the Klan was operating as a shadow organization called the Red Shirts. And he thinks that people in that community were worried that other people outside of a Yadkin would see that as an association with the Klan.
But they were wrong.
But
this is great.
Yeah, my take is they were worried about that probably because they were, in fact, the remains of the organization that was opposed to the Klan.
Sure.
They remembered what Red Strings meant, and they were worried about having that pointed out, about having that misinterpreted, all kinds of things. I think it's pretty clear why Captain Gus Long was called Captain Gus Long and why these Quakers who started a baseball team were called the Red Strings.
This is great.
As far as I can tell, that is the last mention of a living remnant of the Red Strings organization.
I love it. This is great.
I found another newspaper article from 1961 where somebody was saying the Civil War was 100 years ago. Here are some peace organizations that existed then. And that writer mentioned the Red Strings. To him, it's just this incredibly obscure historical artifact.
Right.
But to Dunnigan, the Yadkin Red Strings were a team that was, for him, very much living memory. They themselves, it seems to me, were really clearly connected to the heroes of America from the Civil War.
This is amazing. I love this. I love your history episodes because I can do like the Stan Marsh, like I learned something today. But like, it's just really cool.
We're so good at forgetting stuff.
Yes.
There's so much to remember. Stories like this have to get compressed. And they get edited down and they get condensed. A lot of little details get squeezed out.
Sure. I think it's important. And I think that you just did a really good job of then expanding it back out from a footnote and keeping the story preserved.
Well, thank you.
Somewhere this will get cataloged by a search engine and it'll persist, and hopefully somebody that's interested in it at some point finds it, or hopefully somebody that doesn't know anything about it finds it and is interested in it.
Yeah. I was endlessly surprised as I researched this to see anti-secession organizers were winning elections within the Confederacy during the Civil War. To see that there was immediate organization against secession even before secession had happened. There were demonstrations and rallies against secession before the date that secession took effect. To know that the Confederates, quote unquote, came to power knowing that they were already dealing with counter-rebellions within their own quote unquote territory. That was very surprising to me. And to see how widespread it was and how effective it was, and to see that some of it was so effective that they more or less remain secret today, that's pretty inspiring and cool.
Yeah, totally. I'm going to do something with this. I don't know what it is exactly, but I'm going to do something with this.
Okay.
I got a couple ideas rattling around.
Yeah.
And it's not starting a secret society. But I got a couple ideas that I'll talk about after the microphone's off. But thank you. You've been listening to Arcane Carolinas as part of our spooky season 2024. As always, if you'd like a sticker, send us an email, arcanecarolinas@gmail.com. We'd be happy to mail them out for free. Volume 2 of our book series is out, written by Michael. It's available on Amazon. You can get directly to it from our website, arcanecarolinas.com, or you can just search Arcane Carolinas book on Amazon. It'll come right up.
Thank you for your patience. This was a 2-part episode. We recorded it in one long go, but in the most luxurious studio that we have ever seen. Thank you to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for all the information, and to the State Library of North Carolina for all the information that we used in the course of this, and to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for the use of this studio. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Arcane Carolinas. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. For more episodes, behind-the-scenes information, and links to our social media, check out www.arcanecarolinas.com, where you can also buy the Arcane Carolinas book.
And if you like award-winning horror and science fiction, check out my books at michaelgwilliamsbooks.com. And if you have story suggestions, comments, or questions, email us at arcanecarolinas@gmail.com. And thanks for listening.
It's like how it's not like that. I'm not going to use that reference. Never mind.
Okay.
I had a reference that just would not have worked.
All right.